A barefoot poet who became a symbol of unbridled talent, he was a whisper before the roar. Jim Morrison did more than simply act. He summoned, agitated, and vanished into the fire he stoked. Guitarist Robby Krieger kept quiet about the chaos, beauty, and breaking point that lie beneath the mystery of the door for years. He now provides a unique and unvarnished glimpse into the thoughts of the guy who merged art and insanity. There is a moment in Krieger's memory that is so potent that it continues to influence music history. The tale isn't clean, and the answer isn't straightforward. Jim seemed like a typical man to me. There was nothing unusual about him. But after hearing it, you'll see why no one has ever tried to tell it this way before. From enigma to melody, Jim Morrison was a calm, smart child from a military household before he became the crazy, leather-clad frontman of the Doors. Jim was born in Melbourne, Florida, to a rigorous and highly accomplished U.S. Navy officer named Rear Admiral George S. Morrison. He was raised in a nomadic lifestyle, moving from military base to military installation, which perhaps led to his alienation and disengagement from authority. Later, he enrolled in UCLA's film school, where he developed a deeper appreciation for poetry, literature, and avant-garde art. He became deeply engrossed in the works of Nietzsche, Rimbaud, Blake, and shamanic traditions, which laid the groundwork for his future poetic voice. Morrison was shy, contemplative, and sometimes lost in contemplation, which made him an enigma to most of his contemporaries despite his intense curiosity and artistic ambition. Morrison started wandering around Venice Beach around this time after graduating from college, writing poems and trying out psychedelics. Around that time he got back in touch with Ray Manzarek, a fellow UCLA student who was immediately moved by Jim's poems' profound lyrical quality. Following their decision to become a band, Manzarek connected Morrison to drummer John Densmore. When John took Morrison to guitarist Robby Krieger's home, it was the last connection in the Doors lineup. Robby didn't think Morrison was a visionary or a rock star. He simply kept to himself and kept a notepad. "I didn't think he was unusual," Krieger would subsequently remember. However, it became evident that there was more going on behind Jim's composed exterior when he shared some of his songs. Morrison gave them eerie lyrics like "The day destroys the night" and "Night divides the day on that fateful day," lyrical and absolutely unlike from anything Krieger had ever seen. John Densmore, who remembers another early encounter with Jim, is equally enthralled and declares that he wants to drum to those words right away. Even more startling was the fact that Morrison had never performed in front of an audience and had vivid images of whole performances. Despite his inability to play any instruments, he was able to compose entire songs and would perform them for the band a cappella. They would be arranged around Robby's vocal melodies by him and others, which became a significant aspect of the Doors' distinctive composition process. Krieger considers the incident in his book, Set the Night on Fire, and discovers that Morrison's brilliance lay not just in his ability to write words, but also in his ability to convey his emotions. Morrison's inner universe began to spill out in the form of poetry at that same moment, bursting with intensity, yet far from myth and insanity. It was a small enough jam session to begin one of the most groundbreaking collaborations in rock history. Despite Morrison's modest and barefoot arrival, Robby Krieger immediately recognized that something unique was taking place as poetry struck like a rainstorm. He was muttering lyrics at one point. The subsequent one, he was setting fire to stages. Rock legend turned poet, many people recall Jim Morrison as the untamed, mesmerizing frontman of the Doors. The stage was dominated by the self-proclaimed Lizard King, who exuded a fascinating and occasionally wild energy. John Densmore and Robby Krieger, however, claim that Morrison's development into this legendary figure was far from instantaneous. Morrison was so bashful that he was unable to even look at the crowd when the band first started playing at little venues like the London Fog. Instead, he would sing toward the band while standing with his back to the audience. Jim had to develop his stage persona over time since, as Robby remembers, he had never performed in front of an audience before to joining the Doors. Morrison had an enormous inner world that was simply itching to explode despite his reclusive beginnings. He implied that his transformation into the Lizard King was inevitable when he compared his early creative force to a bowstring held back for 21 years. This metaphor encapsulates the artistic and emotional strain he experienced, which ultimately erupted on stage. Morrison's ease in the limelight increased along with the band's self-assurance and popularity. He gradually transformed from a clumsy entertainer into a dominant rock star whose erratic demeanor became a defining characteristic of their live performances. Krieger's 2021 memoir, Set the Night on Fire, describes Morrison's transformation as a result of gaining recognition as a mythological figure. He realized he was more than just a vocalist. He observed his inventiveness being ingrained in mythological psychological motifs in literature. Morrison's fascination with shamanism and his lyrical alter ego played a significant role in the development of the Lizard King's identity. He was drawn to this enormous, nearly archetypal endeavor because it suggested that he might be a conduit for something bigger than himself, a performer capable of guiding the audience into altered states of awareness. On the one hand, Morrison's charisma on stage allowed for an explosion of creative energy. However, performance and reality started to blend together. Densmore and Krieger describe how Morrison's use of alcohol and hallucinogens deteriorated over time, harming both his personal life and stage appearances. Thus, it is evident that Morrison's transformation from a timid barefoot public poet to a flashy Lizard King was a key component of the Doors' mystery, which still fascinates music historians and fans alike. This transition, which was both psychological and spiritual, served as the backdrop for Morrison and the Doors to permanently inscribe their names in the annals of rock history. The mysterious creative process of Morrison. Like his image, Jim Morrison took an unorthodox approach to songwriting. Robby Krieger and John Densmore have said that Morrison was able to create whole songs in his mind, complete with lyrics and melody. He was incapable of playing any musical instrument, not even a single chord on a piano or guitar. However, that didn't stop him from being creative. Instead, the rest of the Doors would collaborate to develop the instruments around his vocal ideas as he sang his compositions a cappella to the group. The band frequently had to halt and break the song down note by note as Jim explained what he was hearing in his head, according to Robby, who characterized the process as collaborative but heavily dependent on Morrison's inner vision. This approach might sound disorganized, but in the beginning it really aided the band's speed once they were in the studio. The Doors spent over 2 years honing the material in live settings before recording their debut album in less than a week. Morrison had already honed his songs via innumerable rehearsals and performances, many of which were written when he was high on psychedelics. By the time they got into the studio, Krieger-written songs like Break On Through, The End and Light My Fire, which were altered by Morrison's words and voice, were set in stone. Their music's bizarre, occasionally eerie feel was a direct result of Morrison's creative imagination and his skill at using atmosphere and lyrics to create cinematic situations. Morrison also reveals in his biography, Set the Night on Fire, that he used them as tunes to help him recall the lines. He was more than just a poetry poet. Songs to him were whole experiences. The majority of Jim's songs have literary, psychological and mythological allusions. Naturally though, it was his delivery of those words that set them apart. Morrison's vocal delivery, whether he was whispering or shouting from the depths of his soul, as Densmore described it, gave the sound that was essential to the Doors a euphoric quality. It wasn't easy. Ultimately though, it was a spooky blend of rock, blues and mysticism that sounded both lyrical and primordial. Nonetheless, his creative process made his inconsistencies clear. He was extremely perceptive, as seen by his altered state of dreaming, but he was also systematic in how he conveyed his thoughts to the other members of the band. Morrison was able to mentally extract and reassemble his thoughts following psychedelic excursions, which provided the majority of his inspiration. Even for painters of the time, this was a remarkable skill. The Doors' music is ageless and has an enduring impression on rock history because of this sinister creative process of chaos and control. The End's beginnings. The End started out as just a song about breaking up, but eventually evolved into one of the Doors' most bizarre and contentious songs ever. Its pivotal moment occurred in 1966, during a wild drug-fueled evening at the Whiskey A Go-Go. Jim Morrison was discovered cowering beneath a hotel bed in a delusional state, after missing the first set of the night, while under the influence of LSD. Despite the band's customary set schedule, Morrison insisted on performing the end right away after being persuaded to return to the venue. What transpired was a spontaneous and spectacular performance that astounded both the band and the crowd. A startling dramatic conclusion was given by Morrison's spontaneous Oedipal monologue, "Father, I want to kill you. Mother, I want to." John Densmore, the drummer, recalls being utterly stunned at the time, not understanding that Morrison was drawing inspiration from Freudian psychology and Greek theater. The band was dismissed from the whiskey as a result of the performance, but it was also a turning point in their development as artists. Morrison blurred the boundaries between poetry, performance, and raw revelation for the first time. Morrison's Oedipal eruption was not only a display of astonishment, it was the result of several factors. This deed was a manifestation of symbolism and suppressed emotion. Morrison converted suppressed trauma, self-disturbances, and a sense of emptiness towards society in his myth, as described in Set the Night on Fire. Despite the fact that Morrison's statement caused a lot of people to take notice, he was still struggling with the oppression that his soul had internalized and the systems that were forced upon him. If anything, that night was a different type of unraveling that made it possible to discover a fresh appreciation for the Doors' artistic abilities. Instead of being a typical song, the finale turned into a ceremonial performance. Propensity heightened this already vivid imagination, and the conclusion transcended music. Morrison's statement marked the overflowing of his harnessing creative talents under conditions of alteration into revolutionary art, into the fabled investigation of insane subconsciousness. The song, which transforms personal instability into a communal experience, is still a frightening milestone in the history of psychedelic rock and a monument to Morrison's plea for assistance. This performance marked the beginning of a new creative direction for the Doors, as well as an indication that things were about to fall apart. The unspoken conflict with his family. Jim Morrison's public persona was created to be in opposition to the orderly society he was raised in. Deep-seated conflict with his Orthodox military family, particularly his father, Rear Admiral George S. Morrison, was the source of the Lizard King's mystique. Jim made the deliberate act of separating from his parents, which spoke volumes, by claiming both were dead in early Doors press profiles. Morrison and his father, who represented the very authority and structure Jim defied, had a very tense relationship, as Robby Krieger subsequently observed. It was not only a generational uprising, it had a philosophical bent. A distinguished commander, Admiral Morrison, led a U.S. carrier of Navy planes during the Vietnam War. When the Gulf of Tonkin crisis occurred in 1964, he was the Navy admiral in command. The contentious incident that intensified American engagement in Vietnam embodied the principles of discipline, control, and patriotism. Jim, on the other hand, supported anarchy, free speech, and the countercultural spirit of the 1960s. His worldview and artistic expression were heavily influenced by this basic gap. The conflict was ideological in nature rather than merely family, and it manifested itself subtly and explosively in his artwork. Morrison's shocking Oedipal speech at the previously described Whiskey A Go-Go performance at the finale, which left everyone stunned, is the most well-known illustration of this schism. Even though the incident will always be remembered as startling, it was also a hint of a more significant psychological detachment, a way for him to creatively challenge and reject the ideals that were imposed upon him. Later, Krieger viewed this as more than just an act. It was Morrison's method of helping a generation cut its ties to parental authority in the midst of upheaval, deceit, and war. Morrison's familial alienation serves as a backdrop that adds poignancy to his whole narrative. He battled with the emotional load and demanding expectations of his upbringing, rather than just rejecting it. His writing and personality gained depth as a result of this internal conflict. Krieger noted that although Morrison's revolt was against the world, it had a far more sinister, agonizing aspect. These kinds of hidden tensions are occasionally covered up by theatrics and notoriety, show Morrison as a tormented guy, attempting to cope with the gift of a legacy he never selected. In addition to being a rock star, however, a different type of pressure was rapidly approaching Morrison as he struggled with his past. the hefty price of achievement. The artistic cost of the Doors' quick ascent to stardom grew steadily. The band found itself in the midst of the tornado of popularity, touring, press commitments, and high expectations from both fans and record labels. After the enormous success of their 1967 self-titled debut album, which featured classics like Light My Fire and Break On Through, Robby Krieger mentioned this in his memoir, Set the Night on Fire, and in interviews. "Hi, this is Doors member Robby Krieger. Additionally, on October 12th, my new book will be released. Set the Night on Fire is the title." The band spent over 2 years honing the material in live settings before going into the studio, even though they were able to record their debut album in less than a week. Success swiftly erased that luxury. The drive to produce new hits quickly has replaced the time they had to compose tunes naturally. The dynamics of songwriting within the group started to change as the need for new content grew. As Morrison's output started to wane, Krieger, who had already contributed significant pieces like As Light My Fire, began to write more of the music. Once the main source of conceptual and lyrical inspiration, Morrison lost interest in the band's creative process. Krieger claims that the band was frequently rushing to compose songs in the studio due to pressure to surpass their prior success and Morrison's worsening drug usage. This was a far cry from the early days of collaborative experimentation and live trial and error. The fact that he left Morrison, who was growing increasingly disillusioned with both fame and the music business, added to the tension. The atmosphere that propelled his performances became more and more reversed, darkening inside. Jim's increasing reliance on alcohol, which Krieger saw as the worst drug of all, had a negative impact. According to Krieger, there were no signs of drinking in this regard, in contrast to, which he had produced, poisoning his creative inclinations and making him unpredictable and untrustworthy. His peculiarities, both on and off stage, started to erode the band's bond over time. Morrison would enter the battle from behind closed doors and be arrested for public intoxication and indecent exposure. Calumny saw through it all to the band's public persona. With songs from their classic albums, Waiting for the Sun in LA, the Doors continued to enchant people all around the world, woman, but not at no expense. It started to become difficult for the band to maintain the creative energy that had previously distinguished them all because of Morrison's emotionally maladjusted and more distant engagement. The Doors' golden age came to an end as a result of Morrison's emotional breakdown and the pressure to always outdo themselves. Along with opportunity and notoriety, success also brought fatigue, loss, and ultimately destruction. In his memoir, Krieger looks on one of the most innovative collaborations in rock history. Alcohol eventually signaled Jim Morrison's worst deterioration, even though had contributed to his early creative triumphs. Both John Densmore and Robby Krieger agreed that Morrison's main drug of choice in his final years was alcohol. Alcohol also seemed to unbalance and dull him, in contrast to the mind-expanding impact. It closed creative doors rather than opening them. Morrison's creative productivity declined along with his drinking, and his dependability as a performer and bandmate declined. This change significantly affected the Doors' capacity to work as a cohesive artistic piece. In previous years, Morrison would arrive to rehearsals brimming with tunes, ideas, and scraps of strange lyrics. However, he frequently arrived late or not at all as his drinking got worse. Additionally, he was usually drunk when he did. The once enthusiastic leader started to distance himself from the band's process of collaboration. By the time of their later albums, Morrison's contributions were irregular, according to Krieger's memoir, Set the Night on Fire. His decline into alcoholism reflected his increasing disenchantment with celebrity, the demands of the arts, and his own inner turmoil. Morrison's already turbulent public performances were made worse by the intoxication. Whether or if the event actually occurred, the 1969 Miami arrest for reportedly exposing himself on stage has sparked fury across the country. It has seriously harmed the band's reputation. Both Densmore and Krieger recall the negative impact the legal ramifications and media controversy had on the group, which forced them to live under constant surveillance. Because of his drinking, Morrison had a lot of problems with the authorities, had strange performances, and became more and more estranged. Morrison changed from being a lyrical provocateur to an untrustworthy burden to the band and to himself. In order to avoid the mounting legal issues and the demands of celebrity, he and his lifelong wife Pamela Corson relocated to Paris in 1971. He would be able to produce poems and restore his equilibrium with this adjustment. Morrison, however, kept drinking, and a few months later, at the age of 27, he was found dead in his bathtub. The majority of accounts, including Krieger's book, contend that death was caused by heart failure, which was most likely brought on by alcoholism, even though no autopsy was performed. Naturally, this vile plunge into addiction is the last act of a highly dramatic existence, an act that can only be easily comforted by recalling how profitable inner agony and glory may be. One of the most enigmatic and contentious deaths in music history is Jim Morrison's passing on July 3, 1971. His girlfriend Pamela Corson discovered the charismatic frontman of The Doors dead in the bathtub of his Paris apartment when he was just 27 years old. Despite Morrison's well-known contempt for drugs, her first story said that they had used drugs and watched a movie the night before. Morrison started having breathing problems early that morning, according to Corson, but she left him alone and came back to discover him dead. With no evidence of foul play, French officials promptly determined that the cause of death was heart failure, probably made worse by heavy drinking. No autopsy was conducted, which fueled decades of conjecture. Fans and friends were doubtful almost immediately. Several times, Corson's account shifted, stating that Jim had never used hard drugs before, or that he had mistaken it for something else. Conspiracy theories flourished as a result of these contradictions, her personal addiction, and Morrison's legal troubles in the U.S. One especially tenacious hypothesis was put out by Sam Burnett, a former journalist for the New York Times and nightclub manager in Paris, who said that Morrison had passed away in the Rock and Roll Circus Club's restroom. Burnett claims that Morrison passed out at the club due to a drug overdose, and that two dealers covertly brought his body back to his apartment in order to stay out of legal hot water and preserve the good name of Count Jean de Breteuil, Corsine's purported lover and drug supplier. When Marianne Faithfull, the woman who was de Breteuil's lover at the time, told an interviewer in 2014 that Morrison did die from an overdose of a dangerously pure chemical that de Breteuil had given him, this alternative story gained more respect. Although she believed it to be an accident, she was certain that the two guys were involved. The whole facts is still unknown, because Corson and Des Breteuil both passed away within 3 years of Morrison's passing, and no autopsy was conducted. The official story has been openly challenged by a number of Morrison's intimate associates, including his bandmates. An atmosphere of unresolved sadness is only exacerbated by the secrecy surrounding Morrison's death and his associations with strong narcotics. In rock mythology, Morrison's death became a bright star if it was partially obscured. He joined the so-called 27 Club, which also included Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, two other musicians who had died tragically within months of each other. His gravestone in Paris's Père Lachaise cemetery has long ago evolved into a symbol of pilgrimage and fandom. Jim Morrison, the 27-year-old lead vocalist of The Doors, passed away today, according to news reports. However, in addition to age and celebrity, the mystery surrounding Morrison's death may also contain a true narrative that has been forgotten by those who knew it well. Jim Morrison's death is still complicated and multi-layered, regardless of whether it was caused by a serious error, a cover-up, or an accidental overdose. As the individual himself, Krieger reflects. Robby Krieger's analysis on The Doors provides a priceless inside look at one of the most illustrious and tumultuous bands in rock history. Krieger, the band's guitarist and a major author of many of their greatest songs, such as Light My Fire, Love Me Two Times and Touch Me, frequently found himself torn between Jim Morrison's and Ray Manzarek's exaggerated egos. Krieger acknowledges that Morrison's passion may be too much to handle. He admits that it was difficult to live with Jim, likening the experience to wishing they had someone more balanced, like Sting. I don't know. Jim always did something different, so you can't tell what he would have said or done. However, he is the first to admit that Morrison's internal conflict also contributed to the depth and emotional impact of their songs. Krieger attributes the singer's dedication to the song to Morrison's erratic conduct. Morrison was known to reside in the band's office and devote himself entirely to the creative process, even if his absence or arrests sometimes caused rehearsals to go awry. Morrison, according to Krieger, lived it every single day, even while the other members of the band attempted to manage their lives away from the stage. However, it wasn't always viable. The band's creative unity deteriorated along with Morrison's drinking, especially during the soft procession and waiting for the sun periods. Krieger remembers raucous studio nights, a rising feeling of disorder, and hangers-on disrespecting the place. All the way was Krieger's own voyage via the Doors. He joined the band at the age of 18 and had only been playing the electric guitar for 6 months. He was distinctive enough to produce music that was not solely rock-based, heavily referencing jazz and flamenco. Instead of copying well-known guitarists, Krieger created a technique that was quite distinct from all others and was used as accompaniment to Morrison's vocals. Together with the lack of a bassist in the lineup, such self-contained difference became a hallmark of the band's sound, forcing Krieger to use his lead and rhythmic skills to fill in the musical voids. In particular, the slide guitar playing on LA was unconventional. Woman, which turned into a Morrison favorite and the band's final distinctive sound. Krieger recalls mixed feelings of astonishment and lasting grief at the time of Morrison's passing. He remembers being in denial that the news might be legitimate at the time of its revelation because Morrison's death had been so long surrounded by rumors and myths. Krieger interprets the experience and makes reference to Morrison's invincibility by saying, "I thought he would never die." To his buddies, he appeared to be untouchable despite all the danger and turmoil. Krieger acknowledges having frequent dreams about Jim and continuing to envision the world of the playing together, which runs counter to the conspiracy allegations that he is fabricating his death. Krieger's recollections are ultimately more than just anecdotes. They capture the nuanced humanity that lies behind the Doors and Jim Morrison's mystique. Nevertheless, Morrison's tale did not end with his passing. All it did was alter form. A poetic legend's enduring echo. Music charts and performances are just a small part of Jim Morrison's history. It is ingrained in generations' creative and cultural DNA. Morrison continues to be a representation of rebellion, lyrical inquiry, and the high price, in contrast to many rock performers whose impact wanes with time, of unbridled brilliance. His influence is evident not only in the Doors' classic discography, but also in the way contemporary musicians approach identification, stage appearance, and songwriting. The rock poet, a person who dares to cross the lines between art, anarchy, and reality, is still modeled after Morrison more than 50 years after his passing. Morrison was more than just a frontman. He changed the definition of the role. He wasn't performing on stage. He was actually putting his theories, worries, and obsessions into practice. His performances prompted viewers to reflect, feel, and ask questions. They were more like rituals than concerts. Musicians and performers of many genres have been profoundly impacted by this unvarnished, existential approach to art, from the alternative rock genre to spoken word in the modern era. Morrison opened the door for more emotional and intellectual resonance by challenging the notion that rock music had to be straightforward or surface level by transforming lyrics into multi-layered literary interpretations. He is acknowledged for his significant efforts outside of the music industry, with classes and scholarly study examining his poetry and songs. Even serious academics take his works seriously. More than 600 pages of Jim Morrison's poetry, song lyrics, and notebooks were included in the 2021 edition of his collected works, which was edited by his sister Ann Morrison Tuning. The recognition of Morrison as an American serious writer has been further cemented by this book. Morrison left behind a vast literary legacy that defied the Beat generation, in contrast to many of his contemporaries. American poets with a vision and French symbolists. Who can overlook Morrison's influence on these memorials and locations that haven't backed down from paying him respect? Thousands of people visit his burial in Paris's Père Lachaise cemetery each year, making it a popular destination for pilgrims from all over the world. His enduring influence on popular culture is attested to by murals, tribute performances, movies, and fan rallies. Posters and clothing still feature his wild hair, leathery trousers, and piercing eyes. However, his voice endures because of this deeper heritage, the inquiries he made, and the emotional realities he discovered. As a provocateur, poet, or prophet, Jim Morrison's influence endures and never goes away. Thank you for viewing. Please remember to like, comment with your favorite Jim Morrison moment, and subscribe for more rare rock history and music legends if you liked this in-depth look at the Doors and Jim Morrison's unseen stories. To ensure that you never miss an upload, click the bell. Additionally, don't leave. For more memorable moments and behind-the-scenes glimpses, click on the next video that appears on your screen. I'll see you there.